Welcome, everybody. This is the Psychedelic Support Monthly Speaker Series. I'm Dr. Allison Fiducia, and today we're extremely excited about the topic of conversation, addiction recovery with psychedelic medicines. And our speaker is an expert in this area. We have Celina de Leon, who is here. She is the co-founder of Natura Care Programs and the founder and director of the Circle of Sacred Nature. This is a 501c3 church. She is a Stanford graduate, a Fulbright scholar, has a master's in divinity from the Graduate Theological Union, and has received professional training in spiritual care through the art of chaplaincy. Her training as a ceremony facilitator draws upon 20 years of experience with the Amazonian plant medicine, Ayahuasca, and she has a foundation in yoga, meditation, and Ayurveda. So today we're going to be talking about why entheogenic plant medicines such as Ayahuasca, when combined with other therapeutic recovery modalities, can be effective in ways that conventional approaches to addiction may not be. And we'll discuss how the Natura Care Programs approach to recovery is being laid out. I can't wait to hear more about this novel program that was started just last year. And about halfway through, Celina is going to be joined by Todd Youngs, who will share his firsthand account about his recovery process with the ayahuasca and how he works to support others that are part of the Natura Care Programs. So I'm going to hand it over to you now. Thanks, Celina.
Great. Thank you, Allie. Thank you for that kind introduction, and great to be here with you all today. So I'm going to go ahead and share a screen here and go into a short presentation. All right, so I'm going to be talking about addiction recovery with psychedelics and interdisciplinary modalities. So first of all, I just want to just share a little bit about my vantage point. Allie just gave that kind introduction. So I just want to share that, you know, for me, when I think about all of my influences of what influences my perspective on this type of work, I think that my longtime experiences of working as working as a ceremony practitioner, trained in an indigenous lineage, and really relating to psychedelics and psychedelic experiences as sacred medicines. So in the tradition that I am trained from the Kamcha indigenous community of the Alto Putumayo of Colombia, we really consider ayahuasca, or as it's referred to in that tradition, yahe, to be a sacrament, to be a sacred medicine and something that people approach with a lot of care and respect. Also, I will say that I really respect the medicalized approach, the psychotherapeutic approach of working with these substances. When I was doing my master's in divinity, I had the opportunity to do chaplaincy training, as was mentioned, and I had the opportunity to be a sitter in a psilocybin study for long-term AIDS survivors navigating existential crisis. So through that experience, I really got to see what it is like to work with these substances in a more medicalized context. I think it's beautiful and wonderful. And to me, it's all about embracing the diversity that exists right now when we engage with these substances. So regarding Natura Care Programs, I'm going to go into it in more detail, but just to give a brief introduction now, Natura Care Programs is a spiritual care, addiction, and recovery program. It's founded on the basis of spiritual care, mutual aid, longitudinal support, and a non-medicalized approach to addressing addiction and recovery. NCP was created in partnership with Recovery Nexus, a nonprofit that provides mutual aid service, and in partnership with Circle of Sacred Nature Church. As Allie mentioned, Todd Youngs will be joining us. He is a co-founder of Natura Care Programs, as well as a gentleman, Alex Olshunsky. We are co-founders of this program, and they are both incredible individuals who have found recovery themselves from working with ayahuasca and other supportive modalities. So that's really the kind of perspective and the vantage point that we bring with Natura Care Programs. So as we open up this discussion, I just am want to provide this image here of the icebergs. This is kind of a common image, I think, that is offered when we think about addiction, but I really want to just frame this this image and these thoughts of, like, as we look at addiction, recovery, psychedelics, how do we expand the ways that we think about these things? So addiction, yes, of course, it is a habitual pattern that is not helpful for a person, that is often attached to a substance or behavior. But what else is going on for that person? Is there trauma? Is there intergenerational impacts? Is there unprocessed life experiences that they've had? What else is under that addiction? I think given the really unfortunate kind of success rates of our approaches to addiction right now in conventional treatments, I think we really beg this question of how do we look deeper at what an addiction truly is? Segueing right out off of that, recovery. When we think about recovery, traditionally we think about recovery as abstinence from engaging with a particular substance or a particular behavior. But what can it be for us to think about recovery more along the lines of human flourishing, about people being able to live a life where they are truly at peace, living on life's terms, not having cravings, really addressing what is behind the addiction or behind the challenging behavior. And then similarly, of psychedelics. When we think of psychedelics, what else can we think about aside from just the way that psychedelics act on the mind and maybe the neural pathways and things like that? That's very interesting, I think. And also, I think it's really interesting to think about the spiritual dimensions of psychedelics. What is it to think about psychedelics as sacred substances, as things that potentially provide us a pathway to be encountering our spiritual life, the different kind of aspects of our being that sometimes we don't always talk about in modern society. So with that framing, we'll just go into, this area of, there is already lots of emerging research on psychedelics for addiction and the potential benefits of it. There are many studies that have been exploring this at major universities in the United States and abroad. I think I was just looking just yesterday, and there was about 25 different studies that I saw that were related to this topic. So this is an emerging area. A lot of attention is being given to it. Just recently, the largest addiction study to date on a classic psychedelic in the US happened at NYU, or NYU in partnership with other universities. It was led by the Bogenschutz team. The study is the percentage of heavy drinking days following psilocybin-assisted therapy versus placebo in the treatment of adult patients with alcohol use disorder. Not surprisingly to somebody like myself, the study found a robust decrease in percentage of heavy drinking days over and above those produced by active placebo and psychotherapy. So this study, I believe, had 95 people in it, and it was quite comprehensive in that way. What's also interesting about this study is that a spiritual care practitioner did a paper on looking at the spiritual dimensions of some of these people's healing processes. Samantha Padrabarak, I think I'm not sure pronouncing her last name right, but she did a really beautiful work about looking at the spiritual aspects of some of these people's experiences. And I think that we're now at a time where we're opening ourselves more to what it looks like to really consider the language of spirit as we think about psychedelics as potentially helpful for addiction. Now, in terms of ayahuasca research, this is going to be something that I'll be talking about more as it relates to Natura Care Programs, as that is the primary classic psychedelic that we use, or plant medicine that we use in that program. But what I think is what I like to just point out here is kind of some research that relates to different classes of people and their engagement with it, because I think it illuminates some of the ways that ayahuasca can be particularly helpful for addiction. So this is citing Brian Rush's team. Brian Rush is an epidemiologist from Canada who led a really interesting project called the Ayahuasca Therapeutic Outcome Project. And they're looking at protocols of researching the potential of ayahuasca for addiction. So this recently came out in Frontiers in Pharmacology in 2021. So one of the things that he notes is this long engagement of ayahuasca with long-term users. So across several studies where long-term members have been interviewed in U.D.V. and Santo Daime churches, which are ayahuasca churches based in Brazil, members with substance use challenges show either complete remission or considerable reduction of intake. So this, I think, is interesting to point out because not only does it point out what can potentially happen for people when they work with a plant medicine or classic psychedelic over time in terms of how it can help addiction. But also, to me, this illuminates the power of community support and what it is to be in community settings, working with these types of experiences and how that can also be supportive for people navigating addiction. Another study that was cited and that I'm also familiar with for other reasons is a study that was done looking at qualitative analysis of interviews of an indigenous community in Canada participating in a structured ayahuasca retreat. And so in addition to showing benefits for substance use intake, this study also showed benefits for people, pro-social behaviors in other areas of their life. It showed that through these interviews that people were able to access material that they weren't able to access by conventional treatment prior to that. It showed that they felt greater connection to nature, to others, and it also showed that there was just an overall sense of more interconnection with the community as well. And then finally, regarding safety, much of the research suggests with ayahuasca that in well-structured ritual environments, it carries little risk and no addictive potential. I put no addictive potential in italics because I think it's really important when we think about the potential of psychedelics, ayahuasca included, for addiction, that although there may not be physical addictive potential, I think any substance that creates an altered state, I think can be misused. I think that one needs to be incredibly vigilant when engaging in altered states experiences, that even if it's not physically addictive, that one is not getting addicted to it or having that type of relationship to it that might not be helpful in other ways. So just to note there, and I also will talk about that later. So what is ayahuasca? For those who are new to ayahuasca is can be referred to as a tea, or it's really an admixture of two plants predominantly, but sometimes other plants are added. But classically speaking, ayahuasca is considered a combination of a woody liana. In my tradition, we refer to it as the bejuco, or the vine, and it is combined with a leaf, commonly referred to as chacruna or chacupanga. The scientific name for the woody liana is Banisteriopsis capi. Scientific name for chacruna is Psychotria viridis, and for chacupanga is Diploteris cabrena. So it is through the combination of these plants that the very kind of beautiful pharmacology comes about. I will mention here that we really have the knowledge of ayahuasca thanks to indigenous communities of the Northwest Amazon who have been stewards of this plant medicine for many, many generations. And in those communities, it is worked with all in all different ways, but I will come to that later. But just a brief introduction to that. Regarding the pharmacology of it, as I mentioned, there's the leaf and the vine. The leaf is actually what is responsible for holding the DMT, which is thought to be the visionary effect of ayahuasca. And the vine is what contains the harmines, harmalines, tetrahydroharmines. There's really, it's really a mystery, the pharmacology of ayahuasca in lots of ways. We know that it acts on the serotonergic and dopaminergic systems of the body. There's been some preliminary research that shows that the harmalines have a particular benefit potentially with addiction addiction for actually working on like the craving areas of the brain. So that's an emerging area of research. I think it's really interesting. And we also know that the harmines are what is potentially responsible for the purgative effect of this medicine. So once again, just to put it in a little bit more specific context of the different ways that ayahuasca is worked with and the different expressions of it, ayahuasca or yahe, as it's referred to in Colombia, as in indigenous communities, it's really considered to be a traditional medicine, a traditional spiritual medicine, and it's also considered to be something that is accessed for knowledge, to learn about other plants or to learn about hunting or to just access knowledge in different ways. So it has actually a variety of different uses and applications in indigenous contexts, but predominantly it is considered a sacred spiritual medicine. As ayahuasca is expanded outside of indigenous contexts, really all over the globe, there's now a big neo-shamanic movement where people use ayahuasca in different types of settings. And then there are also ayahuasca churches. So in that way, it is used as a therapeutic tool for some people. It is used and engaged with as a sincere spiritual practice. Many people find that they engage with it in a way that it complements their other spiritual practices or their even religious practices. And then distinct from all of these areas, there is the practice of ayahuasca as a religion. There are the very well-founded Brazilian churches, the UDV, the Santo Daime, the Barranquilla, and then there are also newer churches that are being formed around the sacramental use of ayahuasca. So what is the ayahuasca experience? As the case with many other classic psychedelics, it's considered to be a deeply introspective, or it can be a deeply introspective experience, an encounter with oneself. Sometimes it can occasion a deeply unitive and mystical experience. Sometimes one encounters blockages or the roots of stagnation in one's life. Sometimes it can facilitate access to repressed memories, unprocessed emotions, or life experiences. This is just a brief summary of what can occur in an ayahuasca session. I think that these key components that I mentioned here are key components of ayahuasca, and I think these are also key components of why ayahuasca can be especially helpful for people navigating addiction. So most often the case, despite what traditions people work with ayahuasca, it is most commonly administered and facilitated in a ritual context. There's the intentional use of ceremony, of ritual, of music, of different types of things, that different types of practices or just like rituals within the ritual that happens that is understood to facilitate the healing process. And so in this way, for people that navigate substance use disorders or challenges with substance use, the idea of entering an altered state of consciousness with a specifically, within the container that is specifically respectful, intentional, and ritualized, I think is actually a very powerful reframing for somebody that navigates challenges with addiction. And then there are the visionary and purgative properties of ayahuasca. As I mentioned before, and what can happen in an ayahuasca experience, oftentimes that is actually a very visionary experience of one experiencing those things, unity with a higher power, seeing things from the past, understanding things about your life. It's like a person can be visually actually seeing that, and this can be deeply, deeply impactful. This is the case of other classic psychedelics. It's certainly the case with ayahuasca. It's can be a very powerful visionary experience. And then there's the purgative properties of ayahuasca. I think that those who have experience with ayahuasca could probably all attest that a purge with ayahuasca is not not throwing up or going the other direction of like what you had for lunch that day. Like it tends to feel like much more. The purge is really understood to be a way that the body, the mind, the spirit, the emotions are just deeply removed and flushed out of the system. For obvious reasons, those navigating substance use, this can be really, really healing to actually have that physical, embodied, somatic experience of release. Can be very, very powerful, even for those not navigating addiction. I think that for those that learn to embrace that aspect of the experience of this type of medicine, find it to be actually quite beautiful and powerful. And then finally, the physical preparation that is suggested before entering an ayahuasca experience. This goes back to what I mentioned with the ritual, like embedded into many traditions, this idea that you actually prepare physically to enter the experience to get the most out of it in the best way. So once again, bringing that level of intention and intentionality for entering an altered state for somebody navigating addiction, I think can be potentially really helpful. And then, we think about this spiritual care perspective of working with ayahuasca, working with this type of approach. And we might consider that, the etiology of many common ailments, such as addiction, eating disorder, mood disorders, maybe there is a spiritual dimension to that. Maybe in some way, sacraments, substances, things like ayahuasca and other classic psychedelics can be really helpful to get at that material, to understand that material in a different way, to get at the root of what may be the source of dysfunction in a way. And then finally, just want to lift up again, like what it is to really learn from Indigenous context, like particularly in the case of ayahuasca, of just this aspect that it really is considered to be a spiritual medicine. It's understood to be an energetic medicine, like in some way, it's understood in the process of the ceremony of working with music. It's really in some way like a vibrational healing that happens. And oftentimes people find that when they come out of an ayahuasca ceremony, it's like you really feel your whole energy can feel much different. Oftentimes people feel like they have more light. You see more light in yourself and others and so forth. So when it comes down to it, and we think of it as being a spiritual medicine, I think these are just amongst many other things, but if we may boil it down to just some like quintessential aspects of how this may be a spiritual medicine, I think it comes down to these, of that it really can facilitate profound senses of self-love. It can open up the pathway for sincere forgiveness, processing of grief and trauma. It can give intergenerational insights, and it can offer a great deal of acceptance that a person can feel and navigate. So when this happens, when this opens up for a person, it can be particularly helpful for somebody navigating addiction itself. So all that said, after profound awakening and insight, then what? And I think that really this is the question. This is what inspired the creation of Natura Care Programs. Both Todd, Alex, and myself have a lot of experience with ayahuasca, with working with people with addiction. And what we found is that, as in the case with classic psychedelics, that one can have the experience, the awakening, but then how do they truly integrate that into their lives? How do they really work with that? So it was with that. Hey, Todd, nice to see you. I'm going to segue right to you in a minute. With that said, that is really what inspired us to create Natura Care Programs. So Natura Care Programs is, as I mentioned, it's an addiction and recovery, a spiritual care addiction and recovery program. It is a 3-month program, and it really takes into account the idea of a biopsychosocial spiritual approach as it comes to working with addiction and recovery. So in this 3-month program, we have a 5-week virtual curriculum that people go through focused on preparation for ceremony experiences, individual and group counseling, contemplative practice instruction, and really just working with people in their individual story, but also within a group context. Then there is the opportunity for them to join us for a 2-week immersion in Costa Rica, where they have the opportunity to sit 3 times with ayahuasca, and also to be combined with individual counseling, group counseling, contemplative practice instruction, and deep nature immersion. And then after that is a 5-week integration period that happens online, and also individuals are supported to go and seek mutual aid support. Some actually are able to enter recovery residences, work directly with Todd, and we really just look at this idea of what is it to consider longitudinal care. We really know that that working with addiction in particular is something that it's not easily touched upon in just a weekend ceremony experiences, or after just having the aha moments. So how do we really support people through that? As Ali mentioned, we just launched our program last year. We're actually launching our next cohort this month. We actually still have open spots. So if anybody is interested in this type of program, please do reach out to us. And so that's what our program is. And I think I'll just close while I pass to Todd here of just this exciting time that we're in, of really considering that, we have so many things available to us in terms of different healing modalities, different ways of accessing that. And then when it comes to something like addiction, I think that we're really at an important time where we can look deeper into what it means to really heal from addiction and to really offer more comprehensive ways of looking at recovery. And I'll just stop I'm just going to stop here and then pass it to Todd by just sharing really briefly the story of Mary, who was a participant in our program. And I think Mary's story is really great to share, because Mary actually came to us not in active addiction. She had already handled that in some way, but she came to us because she was interested in deeper levels of healing. She wanted to know what was behind the addiction, what was behind what drove her to that. She wanted deeper understanding about her past. And so I just want to lift up that these types of medicines, these types of experiences, really, I think they can be helpful for everyone. And I think that they are not everybody, if it is safe and appropriate for them, but for the person. But I think when it comes to addiction, I think we can think about a more expanded way of thinking about how these types of experiences can be helpful and supportive. So with that, I will stop the screen share and I will pass it to you, Todd, so you can share a bit more about your experience and your approach.
Great. Thank you so much, Cel. And Allison, thank you so much for having me here, or having us here. And it looks like there's a lot of people in the audience today. Great to see everyone, sort of. Anyway, the way I often introduce myself is, my name's Todd Youngs, and I am a gratefully recovering addict. And more importantly than that, I am a joyfully transforming human being. So on an opportunity like this, to kind of just give a little, I think it's probably useful and instructive for me to provide a little bit of my background, kind of so why, give a reason as to why you might be listening to me and how I came to be involved with Alex and Celina and with Natura Care. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'll go back to I'm 55, but I'm going to go back to 1985 because a very critical juncture in my life occurred in September of 1985. I lived in a self-created hell realm of hard drug addiction and alcoholism, as you will hear in just a moment, for almost a quarter of a century. But it was in 1985 that I first smoked crack cocaine. I was already a lover of cocaine prior. Smoked crack, progressed into intravenous cocaine, progressed into intravenous heroin as a way to come down from crack and IV coke. And was a heavy user of methamphetamine, benzodiazepine tranquilizers. And I also developed a very ugly form of alcoholism, as I call it, a Mr. Hyde form of alcoholism. So for about a quarter of a century, this was the way that I lived, pretty much continuously, except for the 12 different times I was locked up in jail or was court ordered to a treatment center, or actually in a few cases, I volunteered for treatment center, but usually it was under the nudge from the judge, as we might like to say. I had to go to prison once, went to the psych ward, was on methadone maintenance 5 different times. Of course, I tried the Suboxone route, tried seeing psychiatrists. And like I said, I did inpatient treatment, I did outpatient treatment, and all of these to no avail. By the time I was 42, when I got sober in 2009, I was, living in my mom's basement. Like my high-minded ideas and life aspirations had led me to this rather sorry condition of being basically an unemployable head case. Collapsed veins, track marks on every serviceable vein on my body, lost half my teeth, squandered work opportunities. It's just a whole litany of attendant miseries that addiction and alcoholism brought into my life. So now, a beautiful thing happened in the spring of 2009. And this is where I'm going, is that's when I began, after I detoxed in jail for the last time from alcohol, benzodiazepines, and opiates, that would be my last trip to jail. Upon getting out of jail, I had the opportunity and privilege to begin sitting with ayahuasca. And what was very interesting is, obviously my heart and mind began to open. I had suffered for a long, long time, and I just couldn't or wouldn't see the light or even feel any sense of willingness or any hope. I guess hope is the operative word here. In those initial ayahuasca ceremonies, hope was restored, and willingness and direction and clarity in my thinking. And I was living in Southern Missouri at the time. So Southern Missouri is not really as I like to say, it's not a hotbed of progressive ideas, spiritual and otherwise. But nevertheless, that's where my journey with ayahuasca began. And in that unlikely place, part of the lessons I got from ayahuasca was how to go back and utilize a 12-step framework, something that I had been exposed to many times and simply could not or would not listen or find willingness to engage in a structured recovery program like that. And so this is kind of where I'm going with the bulk of my conversation here and how it fits into Natura Care. For me, my initial recovery framework was 12 steps. And for some, there are multiple adaptations of 12 steps. It finds its way into Buddhist recovery too, in the writings of Kevin Griffin. Strong elements of AA and 12 steps are found within as sort of precursor sources to refuge recovery, although, refuge recovery and recovery dharma take a explicitly Buddhist lens toward this process. A lot of the underlying principles are the same. And those sort of revolve around self-examination, meditation, prayer, service to others, some kind of trust in a power greater than ourselves, something bigger than us as individuals. And the beauty I found in 12-step recovery was that the latitude given to the spiritual experience there was very broad and roomy. I know that, speaking in a lot of these settings, I can chuckle about this. 12 steps are not always considered all that sexy. I mean, and I understand there are various times throughout history they've come and gone in favor. For me personally, what I found beautiful about that framework is that it gave me a means, a sort of a systematic means of combining spiritual contemplation with action. And, I think Celina probably touched on this. There are many, many beautiful interludes possible with things like ayahuasca. But the question becomes what to do with those temporary states so that they can become permanent traits. And so what I learned was also that, there are various therapeutic modalities. We have cognitive behavior therapy, which is wonderful, motivational enhancement, interviewing, various mindfulness approaches and contemplative approaches. And we utilize all of those in Natura Care. And we find that there's a lot of underlying commonalities to these approaches of personal change and spiritual growth. If there was one thing that, and I guess it's fair to, it's probably necessary to mention this, that like many people that became hardcore drug addicts, I had a lot of experience with psychedelic drugs as a young man. And no doubt those experiences gave me something in terms of maybe a change of perspective on myself, change of perspective on the world. But I also recognize the weakness of just having the experience by itself without a path. And what I learned, of course, 20 years later, coming into the recovery process, was that there was this very, very important need to have some kind of means of integration. And, integration is a word that we hear about a lot in psychedelic communities and circles and in conversations. But then, the question there is, which kind of means of integration is very well suited to the addicted population? Because, truth is, addicts present with a lot of special needs, if I can put it that way. Addicts, while they suffer from all sorts of things like anxiety, depression, in some cases there's trauma, although not in all cases, there's all sorts of things that we present with that are basically fit within the psychological realm. But it is also true that people that suffer from addiction, they also suffer from a disorder which tells them they don't really have a disorder. And so it's very slippery dealing with the addict mind. And we need, and I say this with a lot of love in my heart, but addicts need some kind of structure and guidance to change their life. And while most addicts naturally are resistant to this, that's part of our intrinsic defiant nature. Those are the kinds of tools, those guiding tools and guiding principles that we can find in a variety of not only recovery paths, which are well developed in multiple domains, and very importantly, very easily accessible at low cost. So, but in any case, when I work with different individuals that we, for instance, when we work with people at Natura Care, we spend a lot of time finding out which particular integration, therapeutic, or recovery modality might suit an individual, the severity of their condition, one, their psychological or spiritual orientation. And so there's a tailoring process that we enter into with individuals on a personal level so that their treatment program is personalized to them and their comfort levels and their needs and so on and so forth. It can't be forgotten too that part of this conversation, that in the case of addictive disorders, these are very, very deep maladaptive patterns that have developed in the brain's reward system. If we're speaking of it just on a neurochemical level, the deep rootedness of addiction is something that requires ongoing, I'll use the word treatment or addressing and working with. Because those deep structures really take root in the deepest parts of the human being, and they don't easily remediate themselves with just a few ceremonies over the weekend. And so this is coming back. This is how and why we strongly encourage people to not only, after our program is done, to find some kind of spiritual community, some kind of therapeutic community, whether it's a church community, recovery community, some community-based population of people that are pursuing the same goals. And that is, learning to live a life that is addiction and alcoholism free. So these are all like very strong foundational components to what we are doing. And, Natura Care does exist under the nonprofit is called Recovery Nexus. And the origin or the meaning of that phrase is that we are attempting, to the best of our ability, to form a nexus, a connection between the wondrous, sometimes ineffable and beautiful, powerful world of plant medicine, and in our case, specifically ayahuasca, and creating a nexus of that world with the whole constellation of various treatment and therapeutic modalities, many of which are very well developed. And so we find in that marriage, that nexus, that would be the best way to ensure an enduring transformation, enduring life change in the people that we work with. So a lot of this too is like the recognition that we're not reinventing the wheel. If there already are self-standing modalities that do have strength, do have form, they have understanding, whether that comes from the American Society of Addiction Medicine, whether that comes from some of the newer therapeutic modalities, schools, whichever ones that they are, we feel like there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, that we can use the power or the engine of ayahuasca to move the transmission of these other recovery paths. And so that's a metaphor I often use, that ayahuasca is a very powerful engine, but in order for it to gain traction and any momentum in a person's life, it needs a transmission. And so we have found in Natura Care, like I've been saying, and as Celina, I'm sure, touched on these things before I got here, that there's a vast array of approaches to these problems, ways to language these problems, and ways to translate those powerful experiences into long-term, meaningful change. So with that, I know I've said a lot. I don't know if I want to open this up for question and answer. I was kind of riffing here. Hopefully I was coherent in all regards. But I'm delighted to be here. And if there's anybody that has any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Thanks for sharing your story. Every time I hear it, I'm just so inspired by what you went through and your path to recovery, and then your service to others to really help others see the way of reaching a new way of being in life. So thanks for sharing that. Yeah, we can take some questions now. If anybody wants to drop them into the Q&A, that would be wonderful. And I can kick us off with one question. Do you have a sense if there is anything specific about different psychedelic substances that might be best suited towards addiction recovery?
Well, first, I would say I have a preference for classic psychedelics first, if we can answer that, for a couple different reasons. Because classic psychedelics like LSD, mushrooms, and ayahuasca are highly visionary and can cause lots of deep introspection. They're not what we would call dopaminergic. They're not really active in that brain reward area, the area for which many addicts have a lot of trouble. And so I think keeping it to things like that, although I would say that maybe MDMA and carefully monitor types of situations could be used with the addictive disorders. But here again, it's serotonergic and it's dopaminergic, and MDMA feels really good. So it does present some hazards. Is that a good answer? I mean, and also I think that ayahuasca is especially suited because even among other classic psychedelics, many of those can be used recreationally. Ayahuasca just typically is not used recreationally. And not that I have anything in, sort of ideologically against recreational psychedelics, but it is helpful for the addicted population to be very careful around that. And so ayahuasca is good for that because, as many who have drunk it know, it doesn't really lend itself to casual use.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just
go ahead, Celina.
Yeah, I'll just add that that I just think it's really, really individual, like depending on the person and their story and what resonates with them, maybe at different times. Like I think even in the case of ayahuasca, Todd and I have both worked with people who have, for example, been heavy opiate addicts and have found a lot of support from ibogaine. Ibogaine can be very helpful to flush opiates out of the system in some way, and it can start the healing process. And a lot of people find that after some time, then working with ayahuasca after ibogaine can be particularly helpful because it allows them to go into deeper kind of places of awareness and understanding. But I think it's like a really nuanced question, as you put the study in the chat, like even MDMA for alcohol use disorder, like as we look at as addiction is often being so tightly tied in some cases to trauma, MDMA to access those things can be very, very supportive. So I think there's a lot of nuance there. I think it depends on the person, their story, and even that mysterious quality of what substances they resonate with. As we know, even with ayahuasca, although it's very powerful, very strong, for some people, it takes several ceremonies before they start to actually feel it more deeply. And that's a process that might not be on a person's path to be working with ayahuasca so many times. So it might not be appropriate for them. So I think it really depends.
Yeah, totally. And the research is still pretty early on, but it does look like different types of substances when combined with motivational enhancement therapy, which they used, I believe, for the nicotine dependence study with psilocybin, and some of the cognitive behavioral approaches with using psilocybin to treat alcohol use disorders. So like the MDMA assisted psychotherapy, it does seem that, as you described so well, it's combining these therapeutic techniques with different psychedelic substances to really amplify that therapeutic process, and help to get someone to a better place to navigate behavioral change. But it is interesting, some people say ayahuasca will make them just not want to drink anymore. Or ibogaine, as you mentioned, does have affinity for opioid receptors. So as we continue to learn about these substances, there might be a more detailed path forward or understanding of how the neurobiological effects are playing in. But I really appreciate the spiritual aspects and topics that you brought up today, because that's really doesn't matter which substance, I think, to tap into those modalities. Okay, we do have a couple questions coming in, and usually we have so many. So audience, I don't know if you're sleepy today, but put in more questions. So someone is asking, how would you classify ibogaine for these purposes?
Potentially very powerful. It's somewhat more complicated to work with simply because it does require a little bit more medical support. But I think given the right circumstances, and thank you so much for filling that piece in. I didn't mean to ignore our dear friend ibogaine, but I have seen it really, really help people get over that initial hump. And so I think it is a very powerful tool that more resources should be directed towards making more safely available and at a lower price, because ibogaine comes with a fairly extensive cost. And I would love to see that as a first step for many people. Love to see, infrastructures built around being able to use that. And then later on, following it, like Cel said, with the further psychological exploration with ayahuasca and some of the almost neuro-reparative qualities that ayahuasca brings.
Right. Okay, and then the next question is, what do you suggest for opioids? I think the question is about, is there some recommendation for someone that might be looking into recovery options?
Well, I mean, ibogaine's one route. If one can access it and can afford it, that's a good. Sometimes if people are on a short-acting opiate and they can't do ibogaine, I would suggest they do a Suboxone taper over 2 weeks. This would be my preferred method, so as not to run into a maintenance situation. I would recommend a 2-week taper on Suboxone. And after maybe 3 or 4 weeks of basically being clean, then working with ayahuasca as the way to really jumpstart and catalyze the recovery process and that spiritual change and growth. I mean, in my case, like I mentioned, I kicked opiates in jail, which is where I usually kicked them, which is not the most comfortable way to do it. But my problem was whenever I got out of jail, I would return to using. The last time I was physically clean, right? It's a good place to be. Then I could start working with ayahuasca in a fruitful way, because I wasn't under the yoke of opiate, the physical dependence, but I was in a very open state where ayahuasca could begin doing its magic.
I will say too, from like a more indigenous medicine approach, in my experience of working now with several people who have been pretty hardcore addicted to opiates, in the tradition that I am trained in, and this is common in many indigenous ayahuasca using communities, is that we actually work with purgative plants. And these purgative plants are understood to kind of deeply flush and kind of cleanse out the system before somebody actually takes ayahuasca or yahe. So I worked with somebody who was heavily addicted to opiates. He actually took his last hit at the Houston airport before flying to Colombia. And then in working with purgative plants in combination with ayahuasca, and actually in staying in Colombia for 6 months in care, he was able to find recovery. So just in terms of like there are contraindications for some medicines with ayahuasca, but opiates are actually not one of them. People can be they can have opiates in their system and still safely use ayahuasca is actually the truth. Although there are perspectives of why, all the good reasons why somebody should and could potentially benefit even more if they're completely off opiates before coming to work with ayahuasca. But that is also a pathway that can be accessible to a person.
Great. Thank you. Okay. The next question is about, do you continue to use ayahuasca in your own program of recovery? And if so, what's the frequency? And I think this was probably a question directed towards Todd.
Yeah. These days, I probably drink ayahuasca maybe 6 or 7 times a year. And so it's still part of my program, but it's, obviously, I'll celebrate 14 years on May 9th. That'll be my 14-year sobriety birthday. And these days, I would say 6. There were times early that I drank it quite a bit more. In those first couple of years, I drank quite frequently.
Can you go into that a little bit more? Was it because you were feeling relapse triggers, or?
I was a sick person and I needed a lot of help. I needed a lot. So in the first 6 months, I drank ayahuasca 3 times per month for the first 6 months. Then I went to 2 times a month for the next 6 months. And then in the years afterwards, at least one time per month for a number of years. And in some cases more. Mm-hmm. I just needed a lot of work. And I also, then I came to a place where I did it to celebrate and would hold space for other people that were struggling with addiction. And part of that would mean that when I was guiding a ceremony, I would be drinking it for the purposes of guiding someone else in their ceremony.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And for the Natura Care Program, we kind of went over the format already. Do you think people have the resources needed after completing the program to carry on in other directions or other integration modalities? Because ayahuasca is not always accessible, as we know, in the United States at this point. So it can be.
Yeah. So part of the integration program is a curriculum that happens for 5 weeks after the intensive ayahuasca retreat, and then we also have a mentorship program where people can stay involved with the program. We do ongoing integration calls with the cohorts. And then, as Todd mentioned, as I briefly mentioned before, like really working with individuals to set up their particular care plan in their community that feels meaningful and appropriate is a big part of the work that we do. Todd has a recovery residence outside of Seattle that is available for some people to fold into if there's space. But it just really depends on people's level of care and need. But that's a big part of the integration process.
Okay, wonderful.
I saw one question on, can I respond to the
go ahead.
on gambling addiction? So, I mean, gambling addiction is another, malfunctioning reward response, right? And I can say this, my brother suffered from gambling addiction for 20 years. And after 2 very, very challenging ayahuasca ceremonies, he didn't gamble anymore. And he has not gambled for 12 years. 13 years. And whatever it did to help reformat him with respect to confronting what he had done, and also gave him a new perspective on his behaviors, he started doing some recovery meetings around that for a short period only, but he kind of reformatted himself so that he replaced the desire to gamble with other more life-nourishing activities. So it is there. It's still addressing the same type of disorder, right? Any of the addictive disorders, whether behavioral or chemical, are still rooted in the same places and are also remediated by the same means.
Excellent.
Yeah, I agree. I think that anything related to just habitual patterning, whatever it is, whether it's even eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, like things even on that spectrum, oftentimes classic psychedelics can be very helpful in that way of just breaking up the pathway, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And building new pathways. I think that's the key. You've got these old pathways that the brain has built. Now it's like building new pathways, which become predominant. And then the old ones sort of become dormant.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. And I think very real life, when you think about chronic relapsing of some of these conditions, it just seems like you can quit smoking for 10 years, pick up a cigarette, and then be right back on that other pathway. So that's why I think the integration piece is so important, is to solidify those positive behavioral changes and recognize that that part of yourself may still be there, right? That we all right. Are trying to fill ourselves with something, whether, by looking outside of ourselves. I think that's where the spectrum of need filling comes in.
Right. There's Carl Jung made this great comment where he said that addiction was like the soul's thirst for wholeness. And so there's this it's kind of, addiction is like a failed spiritual quest. In the search to fill ourselves at the deepest level, we end up getting, sidetracked into other less productive pathways.
Yeah.
And if we can fill that inner self, higher power, whatever, then we're less likely to return to those old pathways. And to get, can I get technical very quick? No, never mind.
I was going to say, I was going to offer one more question, because I do think it's a good one. So this person is asking about, how do you talk to like a traditional medical doctor about the interest in using psychedelics as a treatment? Any advice there?
Well, I think we're at a great time where there actually are research studies that can be referenced. I think that can be a really great pathway of just establishing some shared language. And then I just think like sincerity on if you're the one that is seeking treatment or for a loved one, I feel like, or I would like to think optimistically that physicians would be sensitive to that, or ones that really care about healing at least.
Absolutely. And we have some phenomenal doctors and therapists in the Psychedelic Support Network that are open-minded to talk to you about these things. So you can search there. And okay, with that, I think we can wrap it up. I'm going to post the Natura Care link again. I highly recommend you reach out to the team and learn more. The next cohort starts pretty soon, right? This month?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Very exciting. And we did have some questions about financial assistance. Just reach out to the team and ask. I know that is available for some folks. And it's a really beautiful model that you all are working on to accommodate many different types of participants. So thanks for that excellent presentation and coming to share your phenomenal work.
Thanks,
everyone. Take care.